U.S. Pentagon is to hold planned strikes on Iran to allow diplomacy. Iran says talks continue through Pakistani mediation despite the mistrust. The United States is to urge the G7 to tighten sanctions limiting Iran funding. It's 9 a.m. here in Cairo. I'm Henny Saif. You're watching Qnews, and these are the news today. U.S. President Donald Trump said he ordered the Pentagon to hold planned military strikes on Iran to allow more time for diplomacy. In a post on Truth Social, Trump said the scheduled attack on Iran would not take place as Gulf allies work to help secure what he described as an acceptable peace agreement. The U.S. president added that the Pentagon had nevertheless been instructed to remain ready for a full-scale assault on short notice if negotiations fail. Trump said discussions were ongoing with support from Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, stressing that any future agreement must ensure that Iran does not obtain nuclear weapons. Furthermore, U.S. President Donald Trump said there was a very good chance Washington could reach an agreement with Iran over its nuclear program. Trump said negotiations with Tehran were continuing after Gulf allies urged Washington to delay a planned military strike on Iran. Speaking during an event at the White House, the U.S. president said he would prefer reaching an agreement without military action, while warning that the United States remained ready to launch a large-scale assault if talks fail. Trump also stressed that any future deal must prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
No nuclear weapon going into the hands of Iran, I think, and if they're satisfied, we will be probably satisfied also. We've informed Israel, we've informed other people in the Middle East that have been involved with us, and it's a very positive development.
On the other hand, Iran said negotiations with the United States are continuing through Pakistani mediation despite deep mistrust between the two sides. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baghei said Tehran had received American feedback and revisions regarding Iran's latest peace proposal through Pakistani mediators. Baghei said Iran had already submitted its response, while emphasizing that Tehran remained highly skeptical of Washington because of what he described as the U.S. record of undermining negotiations. He also linked tensions in the Strait of Hormuz to military actions carried out by the United States and Israel against Iran. Iran's president said Tehran would not back down from what he described as the country's rights amid stalled negotiations with the United States. In a post on social media platform X, the Iranian president stressed that dialogue with Washington would not come at the expense of Iran's national interests. His remarks came as diplomatic efforts mediated by Pakistan continued to struggle, with reports indicating that Islamabad had shared a revised Iranian proposal with the United States in an attempt to narrow remaining gaps between the two sides. And as tensions rise and diplomacy falters, the United States and Iran appear closer than ever to a renewed confrontation that could reshape security and stability across the Middle East.
Amid rising tensions and stalled diplomacy, the United States and Iran are edging closer to a dangerous confrontation shaped by nuclear disputes and regional instability. Between a faltering negotiation track and military readiness on the ground, Washington and Tehran remain on the brink of renewed confrontation as talks stall over Iran's nuclear program. Negotiations are nearly frozen as gaps widen over uranium enrichment, with Iran insisting on its right to continue and the United States demanding stricter limits. The Strait of Hormuz remains tense, with partial disruptions to shipping raising fears over global energy supplies and potential increases in oil prices. As diplomacy stalls, U.S. diplomacy debates are shifting toward military options, including possible strikes on Iranian military and nuclear infrastructure. Officials say scenarios include large-scale bombing and potential targeting of key sites such as Kharg Island, Iran's main oil export hub. Reports suggest intensified U.S.-Israeli coordination since the April ceasefire, involving extensive intelligence and military planning ahead of possible escalation. However, officials warn that achieving a decisive victory over Iran would be extremely difficult given its geography, allies, and regional capabilities. Despite rising risks and military planning, uncertainty remains high, with analysts warning that any conflict could trigger severe regional instability and global economic consequences ahead.
For more analysis, we now move to Selma Al-Fi'i in our newsroom. Selma.
Thank you, Hani. And for further analysis, we're joined from Aarhus, Denmark, by the strategic and political analyst and journalist, Dr. Nariman Mohammed Ali Mustafa. Welcome to Q News, Dr. Nariman, and thank you so much for joining us. Let me ask you, Dr. Nariman, Iran and the United States are still exchanging messages despite the rising tensions. Do you still believe the negotiation track is still alive, or be both sides simply just buying time?
I would say that the track is technically alive, but I would say that also it's on life support. It's no longer a real negotiation. It's a channel of managing risks. So messages are still being moved forward through the brokers, Pakistan and Qatari intermediaries. And that matters because as long as there's a channel open, that means there is a hope and for a negotiation to be reached, but neither capital in Washington nor Tehran is actually close to a real deal. Washington is more like buying time to keep the fire from exploding, while Tehran is also buying time to absorb the regional setbacks that followed the attacks as it started in February. So I would call it it's a holding pattern dressed up as diplomacy. It's useful for the de-escalation, but not yet, I would say, a path to agreement.
Okay, Tehran continues insisting on guarantees related to sanctions, regional security, and the Strait of Hormuz. Which of these demands do you think is currently the biggest obstacle to any agreement?
I think that sanctions relief, although it's being the headline demand in every negotiation and every offer by the U.S., I would say that the Strait of Hormuz and the regional security are the most obstacle to reaching an agreed deal on both sides, because Iran demands for regional security that's focusing on the removal of the U.S. bases in all the Gulf countries. And the Strait of Hormuz as well. So both of them, they cannot let go of controlling the Strait of Hormuz, especially during this hectic time, because they would need to put a toll on each ship that goes through. Mm-hmm. And it's understandable because of the amount of demolition that the country has gone through. So they need to actually compensate financially on what's happening. So the U.S. is refusing that. the imposing of tolls, so they keep blockading the Strait of Hormuz, and they cannot let go of the bases in the Gulf. So that I would say these are the most obstacles in the negotiation in reaching a real agreement between both sides.
Yeah, well, Dr. Nariman, I'm going to still stay with the Strait of Hormuz, and it's become both a military and economic pressure point. How much leverage does Iran realistically have there, and how concerned is the international community?
I think Iran's leverage in the Strait of Hormuz is real, but it's also overstated because Iran can't keep holding the Strait of Hormuz hostage for too long. Countries, Europe, and I think the Gulf are in the process of finding a substitute or alternative for it. What I would worry about, or what's the situation now, is Iran is trying to, how do you say that, like brush off or harass, they can make the Strait of Hormuz expensive at this moment for the U.S. by causing harassment of tankers, mining incidents, or fast boat and drone provocations. So that's enough to spike insurance rate and global headlines without triggering a full-scale war. So I would say that the leverage is coercive signaling, but not a closure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Iran is willing to stay in the gray zone. No full-scale war and peace.
Yeah, China has become increasingly involved diplomatically, especially after the Trump-Jinping meeting in Beijing. Could Beijing, do you think, emerge as a key player in preventing further escalation, maybe?
Beijing's involvement is somewhat significant, but we should be very careful as to overstate its role. Even though China is Iran's most important economic lifeline, it buys most of its oil, and it has been a key partner for over 25 years. But they are more focused on their interests. They are willing to be the stabilizer of the situation, not mediator, so they can reassure the U.S. of the negotiation is going. They can convince the Tehran side to be more flexible, and they can oversee the brokers' attempt to narrow the gap that actually happens every time each side propose a deal to the other one.
Well, the U.S. continues to increase pressure through sanctions and military positioning, while Iran keeps signaling readiness to respond. Are we now closer to maybe deterrent stability or to a miscalculation?
Deterrent stability, I would say that we are more closer to miscalculation, not stability. What we are watching is not deterrence in its classical sense. It's more of a slow mutual erosion of red lines. So in terms of the attacks, I would say that with each strike, it's collaborated to stay below the full-scale war, and each Iranian response is also collaborated to preserve the face, but without actually pushing it to full-scale war. But again, any mistake, any misfire of hitting a base somewhere, killing more American casualties, any killing of a high commander in both sides can escalate to full-scale war. Even a misfire rocket, as we have seen, as they try to target the Dimona in Israel. And Israel is firing back, hitting the nuclear site in Iran. So it's more of like we said, it's a miscalculation.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Nariman, President Trump has repeatedly said Iran will never obtain a nuclear weapon, while Tehran refuses major concessions. Do you think there's still room for a middle ground formula between the two sides?
First of all, I need to highlight that we can't allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It has been the narrative last year after the 12-day war. They said we obliterated the nuclear threat, which again they went back and said that it's the reason that we attacked Iran this time. So it's a headline that he can't let go of, basically because he wants to ensure popularity in the U.S. and give them a reason why we attacked Iran in the first place, why all those soldiers are dead or killed in this conflict. So both, I would say that Iran caps. There is a room for deal though, but in order for this deal to come through, Iran needs to understand that it managed to get across to the U.S. that they can get the U.S. to relieve some of the sanctions, and the U.S. needs to understand that Iran also looks for a certain cap to the enrichment. It will not let go of the entire uranium, but it will only caps its enrichment below weapons grade level. So both sides need to understand to compromise. They can sell it domestically however they want it. Trump can appear like the tough guy, and the Iranians can appear like they haven't let go of the programs, but they need to be they need to compromise.
Yeah. Well, looking ahead, what are the most likely next steps in the Iran file? Do you think serious diplomatic progress, or maybe prolonged regional tension, or a return to wider military confrontation?
I would say the most likely scenario by some distance is prolonged regional tension, a long gray zone of a strike, proxy clashes, indirect messages, and partial talks without either side reaching a breakthrough. Without either breakthrough or full-scale war. Serious diplomatic, however, progress is possible, but it requires either a change in the administration, or an economic shock in Iran, or a credible mediator who has leverage on both sides that convince people to both of them to come to a table together instead of actually sending messages back and forth. So I would say that the real question for the coming months is whether there will be a deal or war. It's whether the actors can keep managing a situation that's becoming harder to manage by the second.
Yeah. Well, from Aarhus, Denmark, and that was the strategic and political analyst, Dr. Nariman Mohammed Ali Mustafa. Thank you so much for your insights and for joining us here today on Q News. And now we go back to Hani Saif in our studio. Hani.
Thank you, Salma. The Egyptian Foreign Minister, Badr Abdulati, stressed that there's no military solution to the crisis in the Middle East. Speaking during a joint press conference with his Spanish counterpart in Madrid, Abdulati expressed hope for the swift resumption of direct negotiations between Iran and the United States. The Egyptian foreign minister also reiterated Cairo's support for diplomatic efforts aimed at reducing regional tensions and preventing further escalation. Iran's defense ministry said a large portion of the country's military capabilities has not yet been used. Defense ministry spokesman Reza Tlaib rejected statements by U.S. President Donald Trump regarding the destruction of Iran's defensive capabilities. Tlaib said Iran was now more united than ever and claimed American prestige had collapsed in the face of Iranian forces. The Iranian official also stressed that Tehran remains prepared for all possible scenarios amid continued regional tensions. The U.S. Central Command said American forces have redirected dozens of commercial vessels since the start of the blockade on Iranian ports. CENTCOM said in a post on X that U.S. forces continue to strictly enforce the maritime blockade imposed on Iranian ports. According to the statement, 85 commercial ships have been redirected since the blockade began in mid-April. The measures come amid continued tensions between Washington and Tehran over the Strait of Hormuz and regional security. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Iran has the right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes, while welcoming any voluntary concessions from Tehran regarding its nuclear program. Speaking during a press conference in Moscow alongside Equatorial Guinea's Foreign Minister, Lavrov said Russia would not interfere in the ongoing negotiations between Tehran and Washington. The Russian Foreign Minister stressed that Moscow supports any voluntary Iranian steps aimed at limiting aspects of its nuclear program, while maintaining that peaceful uranium enrichment remains Iran's legitimate right under international agreements.
Полное право на обогащение урана в мирных и энергетических целях. Внедриться в этот переговорный процесс мы желаем ему.
Iranians reacted to renewed threats from the US President Donald Trump by calling on Tehran to remain firm in its position. Residents in Tehran said US threats and pressure were aimed at weakening Iran politically and militarily, stressing that the country should not back down. The reactions came after Trump warned Iran to move quickly towards an agreement or face severe consequences. Despite ongoing diplomatic efforts, major disagreements between Washington and Tehran continue over the conflict and the future of the Strait of Hormuz. The United Nations warned that restrictions on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz could trigger serious global economic consequences.
I think the problem is it's a huge problem for the world, and ultimately the lack of fuel and the lack of fertilizer will cause different crises in terms of high rates of inflation, lower growth, and ultimately a food crisis down the line, and particularly affecting the countries who can least afford it. So that is why he wants to make sure that basic freedom of navigation, as enshrined in the law of the sea and other relevant laws, is restored.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he would urge G7 nations to tighten sanctions aimed at limiting funding for Iran. Speaking ahead of a G7 finance ministers meeting in Paris, Bessent said Washington wanted allies to strengthen sanctions measures targeting what he described as Iran's war machine. The meeting comes as global markets react to rising inflation concerns linked to the Iran conflict and higher energy prices.
Just back from Beijing with President Trump for a very successful visit where we talked.
And while diplomacy surrounding Iran's nuclear program in the Strait of Hormuz remains under intense international pressure, another dangerous front tied closely to the wider regional crisis continues to escalate in Lebanon, where Israeli strikes, Hezbollah activity and fragile ceasefire efforts are keeping tensions at a boiling point.
كل المستهدفين هن مدنيين. وضع شيء مرعب، شيء بخوف.
Lebanese President Joseph Aoun said negotiations with Israel are focused on securing an Israeli withdrawal and maintaining the ceasefire. Aoun said Lebanon's negotiating framework includes an Israeli withdrawal, a sustained ceasefire, deployment of the Lebanese army, committed to doing everything possible to stop the war and protect Lebanon and its people. The Israeli military issued new evacuation warnings for areas in the southern Lebanese city of Tyre aimed amid the threats of intensified strikes. Now, the Israeli military ordered residents to immediately evacuate a building in the city of Tyr, claiming Hezbollah was carrying out military activities in the area. Israel warned of what it described as heavy strikes and also issued a separate evacuation notice earlier for residents in Burj al-Shameli, instructing them to move at least 1,000 meters away from the targeted zone.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear. If you look at that,
or we're out.
Egypt's President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi stressed on the importance of expanding renewable energy projects and reducing dependence on traditional fuel resources. During a meeting with the Egyptian Prime Minister, the Electricity Minister and the Presidential Financial Advisor, President el-Sisi emphasized the need to build a balanced energy mix that supports Egypt's ambition to become a leading regional hub for green energy. The Egyptian president also directed the government to intensify efforts to attract more investment into the energy sector in support of national development goals and long-term sustainability plans. Authorities in California are investigating a deadly shooting at the Islamic Center of San Diego as a possible hate crime. Police said 2 teenage gunmen opened fire outside the mosque, killing a security guard and 2 men before suspects were later found dead from apparent self-inflicted gunshot wounds. San Diego Police Chief Scott Wall said local authorities and the FBI are jointly investigating the incident, although no clear motive has yet been identified. Officials also said there had been no prior warning of a specific threat targeting the mosque or other public locations before the attack. Beekeepers in West Virginia are struggling with record honeybee losses driven by disease, parasites, and pesticide exposure. Beekeepers and scientists warned that rising colony losses are threatening honey production and pollination efforts across the United States. Experts say parasites, viruses, and pesticide exposure are among the main causes behind the growing crisis. The concerns come as researchers fear government spending cuts could threaten the future of the country's oldest bee research laboratory.
But as a beekeeper, the different versions, the newer versions.
Dogs dressed in football jerseys took to the runway in Singapore as Adidas launched its first pet clothing collection. Pets wearing Japan and Argentina football shirts joined their owners during a runway event at the Fur Kids Fiesta in Singapore. The showcase marked the launch of Adidas' first collection designed specifically for pets. Pet owners said the outfits allowed dogs to share in the excitement of major sporting events such as the FIFA World Cup. These are all the news we have for now, but before we go, let's take a look at the top headlines making the news this hour. The U.S. Pentagon to halt planned strikes on Iran to allow diplomacy. Iran says talks continue through Pakistani mediation despite the mistrust. And the United States is to urge the G7 to tighten sanctions limiting Iran funding. That brings us to the end of this news bulletin. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for watching Q News, your window to the latest developments from across the region and around the world.